So give us some practical advice. If I recognize my family and my family business are in, say, the third stage of that conflict, and I'm scared straight, but maybe I'm not the majority owner, or maybe I'm the next generation. How can we begin to course correct when we recognize we're kind of heading down a bad path, but we may not all be equals in terms of power?
Yeah. Well, look, I think this is hard because it's actually not something that you can solve on your own. Um, you can have that realization. And if everyone else sort of still prefers the conflict to the resolution, then it doesn't mean that you can just go out there and fix it. I think the thing you can do is to think about how are you taking whatever time, energy, relationship capital that you have, and how are you directing it? And are you using your influence, whether it's significant or not, to try to resolve the situation, or are you feeding into the dynamics and kind of making it worse? And I think the things that you can do is ideally to help to set an example of talking about sort of saying, look, using the language of we as opposed to us versus them, right? The language of we need to figure this out. We can't afford to have this continue. We need to come up with some sort of resolution, and we need to be willing to sacrifice, just as we have in previous times. We can't always get whatever we want. There's something that we can only accomplish by doing this together. And so I think, there is a sobering reality that as an individual in a complex situation, you may not be able to actually be the one to solve it. I think the best you can do is to sort of look for those moments. And there's that expression, never waste a good crisis. Like if there's a moment where people, you recognize there's some issue, or there's some, COVID or something else that caused you think there might be an opening for people to rethink it, jump in and say, okay, let's try to work on this. Let's get ourselves focusing first on what's the benefit that we all have to gain by solving or addressing these issues. Put the issues aside for the moment. The first thing you want to do is to get everyone to understand the value of resolving the conflict, which might be avoiding something negative, like a lawsuit or a sale of the company or the end of relationships. And then the next thing you want to do is to get people thinking about how do we want to have this conversation? It's just like when if you're playing a board game or you're playing sports in the backyard, you don't just jump in and start playing, because then people are going to have a disagreement like, oh, like, how do I win? What are the rules here, right? So you don't just jump in and start debating what is the right dividend policy or whatever. You start by saying, like, how are we going to have this conversation? What are some rules that are going to keep us all on the same page? All these is the pre-work that you have to do before actually jumping in and trying to resolve the situation.
So what might be some good examples of rules to have a healthy conversation that's addressing a conflict or a disagreement?
Yeah. I think, they're frankly just a lot of them are just common sense. And the way that one way to generate them is actually to go around a conversation and say, these are my hot buttons, because all of us have them. All of us have things that when they occur in a conversation, we start to get uncomfortable. We start to, disengage or our fight or flight instinct kind of is triggered, right? And so to understand what some of those things are in your family, for some people, it's the really loud voices that you're talking about. When people in some families, when voices escalate, people turn, they basically disconnect and say, I can't have this conversation. I'm going to leave. Other people, it's more of a physical thing. Like if you get up into my face, like that's going to be a problem. So understanding what are the things that make people feel both more and less comfortable are really important. And you want to create some ground rules about that. Another thing is you want to give people some power to influence the conversation. And so one thing that can be really helpful is just giving everyone the ability to call time out, just to say, look, this conversation is not headed anywhere constructive. I don't want to say anything other than we need a break. And maybe we can come back around and kind of try again in 5 minutes or a week, right? When we can come back and have a better discussion about it. So you're really trying to say, what are some ways of constructing and creating and putting us in a position to have a better dialogue and avoid some of the things that have gotten us into trouble in the past.